Barbara Martin spent the last 10 years of her life dreaming of escaping the small town where she was born and raised. First and foremost, the recent high school graduate was craving freedom, which life on a small farm in Ohio could hardly give her. Barbara's parents, Megan and Robert Martin, weren't well off, and therefore they understood perfectly well that they couldn't afford to move to a big city. Barbara dreamed of living in New York, which seemed like the center of the universe to her. The worst part was that Barbara's brother did follow his dream and had left the farm a year earlier. Stephen had always been a headstrong and somewhat reckless young man who was used to dictating his own terms to his parents. Mrs. Martin didn't take her son's departure well. She was very upset by his absence. Because Stephen moved to New York, despite the protest of his parents, Barbara harbored a grudge against him, hiding it deep in her soul. The young woman considered his decision a real betrayal, and therefore she flat out refused to keep in touch with her brother. Barbara didn't want to live a bleak life on the farm that had been her home for over 20 years. The young woman didn't see anything good in depriving herself of a future and working in a field from dawn to dusk. In Barbara's dreams, New York City could give her everything she craved so much, living in a small town in the north of Ohio. Unfortunately, moving to the metropolis was out of the question at that point. That was partly due to Mrs. Martin's desire to keep her daughter at home, and partly due to the illness of the head of the family. Robert Martin started feeling unwell shortly before the departure of his son, who didn't hesitate to leave his father in the care of the women of the family. The doctors who ran Robert's tests shrugged their shoulders and spoke in an undertone about the terrible diagnosis: cancer. Despite the timely departure, Robert Martin's condition worsened every day. The man was fading before his family's eyes, and more than anything else, he was afraid of dying before seeing his son again. The fact was that having left for New York, Stephen cut off almost all ties with the family. During the year that the young man lived in the metropolis, all he did was send his family a postcard for Christmas and call his mother on her birthday once. Some brother I have. Our father is sick, and he's living his best life in the city, Barbara said, without hiding her resentment. At moments like that, Mrs. Martin always scolded her daughter and reminded her that Stephen was just as much a member of the family as she was. Of course, in the depths of her soul, Barbara understood that her mother was right, so she rarely crossed the line in her statements. Taking care of her sick father, the woman anxiously watched the features of his face sharpen as life gradually left his body, exhausted from the disease. Unfortunately, despite several rounds of chemo and well-chosen drug therapy, Robert Martin passed away 3 days before his 60th birthday. It was no surprise that all the funeral arrangements and all the paperwork fell on the shoulders of Barbara and her mother. That day, Mrs. Martin seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant. The worst part was that Stephen didn't even come home from his father's funeral, and it actually turned out to be impossible to find him at the return address indicated on the postcard. Apparently, the man constantly moved from place to place, renting apartments in different parts of the city. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Stephen's phone was disconnected, or maybe he changed his number too. Barbara couldn't help but feel betrayed. The woman was hurt by the fact that her brother completely stopped caring about his family. But after the funeral, Barbara's attention was drawn to an event that seemed rather strange. It all started with the fact that the woman accidentally saw a massive jewelry box in her mother's bedroom. It contained all kinds of rings, gold brooches, and chains. Barbara could swear that she had never seen that box before. So where did it come from? Was it always in our house? The woman thought. Barbara was taught to be prudent from an early age and knew that her family didn't have money. And now it seemed that they always had all these valuable things. But having asked her mother about the origin of the jewelry, Barbara suddenly hit a wall of alienation and disapproval. You shouldn't worry about it. You just lost your father. "Thinking about money right now is inappropriate at the very least," Mrs. Martin remarked in an icy tone. But Barbara couldn't get the thought of the secret jewelry box out of her head. The woman was alarmed by the reaction of her mother, who seemed determined to hide the jewelry from her. Be that as it may, Barbara wasn't going to pester her mother with questions about it. Instead, she focused all her energy and attention on moving to New York, where her brother had been living for over a year now. Since the family didn't get any news from Stephen in a long time, Mrs. Martin was getting seriously alarmed and decided to turn to the police. But the local sheriff took the older woman's statement with a fair amount of skepticism. "Why haven't you come sooner, ma'am? You haven't heard any news from your son for over a year, and you only decided to deal with it now?" the police officer asked, not even trying to hide his smile. Mrs. Martin turned pale and tried to find a logical explanation for her actions. But the sheriff just shook his head and said that he would take the necessary measures. Fortunately, the police officer kept his word and submitted a request to the New York Police Department. They found Stephen within 2 weeks. However, despite the close attention to this person, Stephen flat out refused to return to Ohio. The old woman took her son's indifference very hard. Along with her husband's death, these two events took a great toll on the health of the elderly woman, who had been complaining of chest pains for some time already. Ultimately, Mrs. Martin ended up at the hospital having suffered a heart attack. Thus, Barbara once again had to forget about her dreams of moving to New York. Visiting her mother at the hospital every day, Barbara was afraid of only one thing: of losing the last person near and dear to her. For the sake of her mother's health, the woman was ready to stay in Ohio and live there until the end of her days. "Mommy, just get better, okay?" Barbara said with tears in her eyes. Visiting her mother at the hospital had become a kind of ritual for the young woman, which she repeated daily. One day, Barbara came to her mother's room and saw a man sitting at the head of her mother's bed. Looking more closely, the woman recognized the familiar face and exclaimed, "Stephen, is that really you?" The man turned around and, having seen his sister's face, immediately looked away in embarrassment. Then Stephen started lying, claiming that he was too busy with work and didn't have time to call or come out for a visit. Of course, on the one hand, Barbara was mad at her brother, but on the other hand, she couldn't help but feel happy to see him, and therefore she was ready to forgive him. But when Stephen and Barbara stepped out of their mother's room and had a heart-to-heart, it turned out that Stephen didn't just come out to visit his family. "I need money, a very large amount. I'm going to start my own business," the young man said during lunch. "But where would you get so much money? You know very well that we grew up in poverty," Barbara objected, sincerely hoping that her brother didn't know anything about the jewelry box. But as it turned out a little later, Stephen was well aware that his mother had a stash of valuables. "I saw the jewelry box as a boy. Mom hid the box in the closet, but I still found it. Dad yelled at me for it, but that's not important anymore." Stephen nodded. Barbara looked at her brother carefully and realized that he wasn't joking. So, Stephen didn't know about the jewelry, and now he expected to get his share from their mother. "Why would Mom even need all this jewelry now? I could sell some and start my own business," Stephen said hopefully. But to the great chagrin of the young man, Mrs. Martin didn't only refuse to give her son a share of the family's treasures, but also didn't want to reveal the secret of their origin. At that point, Stephen realized that he would only be able to get his hands on the jewelry after his mother died. Of course, deep down, the young man wished only the best for his mother and didn't even want to think about getting the jewelry as an inheritance. Barbara, who didn't care about money at all, shared her brother's opinion. After being rejected by his mother, Stephen was feeling frustrated and decided to return to New York. The young man always felt burdened by the family ties and didn't feel all that enthusiastic about going back to the family farm. However, when only a few hours remained before Stephen's departure, the hospital called with news of Megan Martin's demise. Stephen and Barbara had never been so close in their entire lives as they were grieving for their late mother. The young people were so devastated that the funeral passed in an atmosphere of mourning, hopelessness, and sadness. It was only a month later that Stephen and Barbara started recovering. It was then that the young people started thinking about dividing their parents' property. As the older brother, Stephen wanted to take the jewelry box and even went to court over it. Barbara didn't just stand aside and decided to fight her brother for the inheritance. Litigation continued until a notary came to see the young heirs. He was there to execute the will of the late Mrs. Martin. Realizing that, among other things, they were going to get the box with the coveted jewelry, Stephen felt a strong spiritual uplift. So did Barbara, who was eager to finally learn the secret of the jewelry. Imagine the surprise of Barbara's kids when the notary announced that the aforementioned jewelry box had been handed over to Mr. and Mrs. Edwards, who lived in a neighboring state. The address and phone number were attached so it would be easier to find the people mentioned in the will. Having read out the will of the deceased woman, the notary solemnly retired, leaving the legitimate heirs very confused. What is happening? We lived in poverty all our lives, and now our parents decided to leave us without an inheritance too? Stephen was indignant. Unlike him, Barbara was in no hurry to blame their parents. The woman felt that the jewelry box was hiding some secret, and only the couple mentioned in her mother's will would be able to shed some light on this story. Having decided not to put things off, the siblings set off to find the Edwards couple the very next day. They found the address they needed fairly quickly. Stephen and Barbara were surprised to see that the house was actually a huge 3-story mansion, which they couldn't help but admire for its luxury. Why would Mom decide to leave the jewelry box to some rich people? It looks like they have enough money as it is, Stephen said, feeling hurt. The man didn't have time to finish his thought because the door of the mansion swung open and a sweet old woman of about 80 appeared in the entrance. Come in. My name is Charlotte Edwards," the lady of the house said with a smile on her face. Stephen wanted to hand over the package with the box right away, but the old woman's hospitality confused him. Thus, the young people had to follow the old woman into the living room, where a table full of food was waiting for them. There was also an old man sitting at the table. It was Charlotte's husband. Having no desire to spend more time than he had to with the old couple, Stephen took the box out of the bag and set it on the table. What happened next changed everything. "Dear God, I haven't seen it in years," Mrs. Edwards whispered with tears in her eyes. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Stephen asked, exchanging glances with his sister. The old woman only smiled in response. She took her guests by the hands and escorted them to the table. Mrs. Edwards began her story from afar, from the time when her daughter got engaged to a poor young man and ran away from home. Since the woman didn't have any cash, she took the family jewelry box with her. Mr. and Mrs. Edwards didn't try to find their daughter, allowing her to make her own choices. Ever since then, the young woman and her parents hardly saw each other. Mrs. Edwards only knew that her daughter had 2 children, born one after another. At the end of her story, the old woman said something her guests were very eager to hear. "My daughter's name was Megan Martin." Still in disbelief, the brother and sister looked into the old woman's eyes and realized that she was telling the truth. "So, does this make us your grandchildren?" Barbara was the first one to come to her senses. "Yes, dear, you two are my grandchildren," Mrs. Edwards answered, smiling. That day, Barbara and Stephen stayed at their grandparents' house until late in the evening. It seemed to the young people that it was all just a dream, and that they would soon open their eyes and everything would disappear into a ghostly haze. Of course, Charlotte Edwards divided the family jewelry in half and handed it over to her grandchildren. Only now did the young heirs understand the motives behind their mother's behavior before her death. Apparently, having included the box in her will, the woman wanted to return it to its rightful owner. However, having received such an expensive gift from their grandmother, the young people didn't live in poverty anymore and could confidently step into a new and prosperous life.